25. Famous black people who hid they were gay until death. Then and now, 2025. What if some of the most iconic black legends in history were hiding a truth so personal they took it to the grave? Behind the fame, the awards, and the global admiration, 25 groundbreaking figures lived double lives forced into silence by a world that refused to accept them fully. From chart-topping singers to civil rights heroes, their private truths remained locked away. Until now. In this video, Legends of Black Excellence uncovers the powerful and often heartbreaking stories they couldn't tell. Don't just watch, listen, and rethink everything you thought you knew. Which untold story will surprise you the most? Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker's life was a symphony of reinvention, courage, and artistic brilliance. Born in 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri, she escaped the crushing grip of poverty and racism in the United States by fleeing to France in her early 20s. There, she not only became a cabaret sensation, but also one of the most admired black performers in Europe. Her performance in La Revue Negre and her infamous banana skirt act at the Folies Bergère established her as a fearless avant-garde entertainer who defied convention and captivated the world. Yet behind her glittering fame and political activism lay facets of her identity she never made public. Though she married several men and adopted 12 children to form her Rainbow Tribe, a model for racial harmony, Baker also maintained intimate relationships with women. Among the most speculated was her closeness with Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, an association noted in letters and third-party accounts, but never publicly confirmed during her lifetime. In an era when same-sex relationships could end a career, especially for someone who became a symbol of femininity and sensuality, Baker kept these personal connections carefully veiled. Her private romantic inclinations were often overshadowed by her public heroism. During World War II, she operated as a spy for the French resistance, using her celebrity to gain access to high-ranking officials and smuggle intelligence in her sheet music. After the war, she became a civil rights activist, refusing to perform for segregated audiences in the U.S., and speaking at the March on Washington in 1963 alongside Martin Luther King Jr. Despite her trailblazing achievements, Baker's full identity remained hidden from the public eye. When she died in 1975, she became the first black woman to receive full French military honors, a national hero, yet still misunderstood. Her queerness was never discussed openly during her lifetime, a truth left to be pieced together only after her passing. Today, her legacy is more than the glitz of Parisian stages or wartime valor. It includes the unspoken sacrifices she made as a queer black woman navigating fame, resistance, and reinvention in a world that demanded silence. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor wasn't just a comedian, he was a cultural force who broke every boundary with unfiltered truth and searing wit. Born in 1940 in Peoria, Illinois, he grew up in a chaotic environment, raised in his grandmother's brothel amidst poverty, trauma, and instability. These early experiences became the raw material for his comedy, where he dissected taboo subjects like race addiction, politics, and personal demons with unmatched candor. His influence reshaped American stand-up, earning him 5 Grammy Awards and the title of one of the greatest comedians of all time. But for all his openness on stage, there were parts of Pryor's life he kept shrouded. Although married 5 times and father to 7 children, Pryor's sexual fluidity only came to light years after his death. During his career, he made cryptic jokes about encounters with men, but they were largely interpreted as comedic exaggeration. It wasn't until Quincy Jones in a 2018 interview mentioned Pryor's romantic relationship with actor Marlon Brando that the truth began to surface. Pryor's widow, Jennifer Lee Pryor, confirmed the revelation, adding that Richard had written openly about his experiences with men in his diaries. He never publicly identified as bisexual or gay, likely due to the time period where homophobia in both mainstream and black communities could have destroyed his career. Still, Pryor managed to challenge the boundaries of masculinity through his vulnerability and willingness to address topics few dared touch. Pryor battled multiple sclerosis for nearly 2 decades before his death in 2005. Despite his failing health, he remained a symbol of unrelenting truth-telling. Yet even as his body gave out, his legacy grew. Only after his passing did the full complexity of his identity emerge, offering deeper insight into a man whose life was both wildly public and intensely guarded. Richard Pryor's legacy is not only in the laughter he gave the world, but in the hidden courage he carried alone. Sylvester James Jr. Sylvester James Jr. burst onto the music scene in the 1970s with a voice and presence that were utterly unforgettable. Born in Los Angeles in 1947, he started singing in Pentecostal church choirs, but his flamboyance and gender nonconformity clashed with the religious world he grew up in. It wasn't until he moved to San Francisco, a city embracing queer expression, that Sylvester finally found a space where he could thrive. With a soaring falsetto and magnetic energy, Sylvester became an icon of the disco era. His 1978 smash hit, "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real," wasn't just a song, it was a liberation anthem. He embodied and celebrated queer identity at a time when most black artists were pressured to conform to rigid heteronormative standards. While many concealed their sexuality, Sylvester was defiantly open. He wore glittering gowns, makeup, and high heels on stage, challenging norms and redefining what it meant to be a black male performer. Despite his openness, Sylvester remained private about his romantic relationships. He often expressed tension between his religious upbringing and his queer identity, creating a quiet internal conflict that never fully resolved. He refused to hide, but also kept some parts of his heart locked away from the public gaze. As the AIDS crisis ravaged the LGBTQ+ community in the 1980s, Sylvester became one of its most outspoken voices. Diagnosed with HIV, he used his platform to advocate for awareness and compassion. Even as his health declined, he performed until he physically couldn't anymore. Sylvester passed away in 1988 at just 41 years old. At his request, his funeral was held at the Love Center Church in Oakland, and he left instructions for the congregation to rejoice, not mourn. His legacy remains in every high note, in every unapologetic strut, and in every queer artist of color who dares to be seen. Luther Vandross. Luther Vandross possessed one of the most recognizable and emotive voices in R&B history. Born in New York City in 1951, he rose to prominence in the early 1980s with soulful ballads like Never Too Much and Here and Now, capturing the hearts of millions. Over his career, he sold more than 40 million records, earned 8 Grammy Awards, and established himself as the definitive voice of romantic yearning and vulnerability. Yet despite his immense fame and public persona as a crooner for women, the man behind the microphone carefully guarded his private world. Throughout his life, Vandross never publicly addressed his sexual orientation. Rumors swirled, but he consistently avoided questions about his romantic relationships. It wasn't until after his death in 2005, following complications from a stroke, that close friends including singer Patti LaBelle and writer Bruce Vilanch confirmed what many had quietly suspected: Luther had lived as a closeted gay man. According to those closest to him, Vandross feared that coming out would alienate his loyal female fan base and bring personal distress to his deeply religious mother. The emotional depth in Vandross's music often mirrored the internal conflict he endured. His lyrics spoke of unrequited love, longing, and lost sentiments that carried more weight when viewed through the lens of a man unable to openly express his truth. Despite his private pain, he remained a consummate professional and perfectionist, known for meticulous production and heartfelt delivery. Though he never publicly embraced his identity, Luther Vandross left behind a legacy that resonated across generations. His story is one of restraint in the face of judgment, of artistry born from emotional complexity, and of a man whose voice gave comfort to millions, even as he denied himself the comfort of being fully seen. In retrospect, his silence speaks volumes, deepening the legacy of a man who gave so much of his heart while hiding parts of it away. James Baldwin. James Baldwin was more than a writer. He was a moral witness to the struggles of race, sexuality, and identity in 20th century America. Born in Harlem in 1924, Baldwin grew up in a strict religious household and initially sought refuge in the church before turning to literature. He became a celebrated novelist, essayist, and activist whose words peeled back layers of oppression with uncompromising clarity. Works like Go Tell It on the Mountain, The Fire Next Time, and Giovanni's Room remain powerful meditations on alienation, love, and human dignity. Though Baldwin's fiction and essays often addressed themes of homosexuality, he rarely discussed his own orientation publicly. Giovanni's Room, 1956, one of the earliest mainstream novels to explore same-sex love with tenderness and tragedy, was considered groundbreaking, but Baldwin was warned it might ruin his literary career. Nonetheless, he refused to censor himself, choosing honesty over acceptance, even if he remained guarded about his personal experiences. In private, Baldwin was openly gay and had relationships with men throughout his life. Yet he resisted simple labels, often emphasizing the complexity of identity in a society that sought to reduce people to categories. He lived much of his adult life in France, where he found more freedom to express himself without the crushing weight of American racial and sexual prejudice. Still, he remained deeply connected to the civil rights movement, aligning with figures like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Medgar Evers. Baldwin passed away in 1987, leaving behind a legacy that is both literary and revolutionary. Though he never officially came out, his work boldly carved space for Black queer existence in literature and public discourse. He showed that one's truth could be spoken not just in declarations, but in stories, essays, and ideas that outlast silence. In his life and death, Baldwin embodied resistance not only against racism, but also against the erasure of queer Black voices. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday, born Eleanora Fagan in 1915, is remembered as one of the most haunting and emotionally evocative vocalists in American music history. Nicknamed Lady Day, her voice conveyed a raw vulnerability that spoke of both personal anguish and social injustice. With songs like Strange Fruit, a chilling protest against lynching, she became not just a jazz icon, but a cultural symbol of defiance in the face of racial terror. Her artistry, forged in pain and resilience, redefined jazz and blues across generations. Holiday's personal life, like her music, was turbulent and complicated. She endured poverty, childhood trauma abuse, and lifelong struggles with addiction. While she had high-profile relationships with men, including a series of troubled marriages, accounts from friends, fellow musicians, and biographers also suggest that she engaged in romantic relationships with women. She never publicly identified as bisexual, but her private relationships with women, including rumored affairs with actresses Tallulah Bankhead and Jean Dark Davis, were known in her inner circle. Navigating fame in the 1930s and 40s as a queer Black woman was nearly impossible without concealment. Holiday's career was already under attack from law enforcement due to her race drug use and defiant attitude. Openly embracing same-sex love would have added another layer of scrutiny she couldn't afford. Instead, she expressed her depth through music, each performance a reflection of her heartbreak, repression, and quiet strength. Billie Holiday died in 1959 at age 44, handcuffed to a hospital bed, targeted by authorities until her final breath. Her legacy has endured far beyond her short life. The subtle truths about her identity, like her sexuality, emerged in the shadows of her legend, revealed only by those who dared to look beyond the myth. Today, she is celebrated not only for her groundbreaking voice, but also as a symbol of unacknowledged complexity, a queer Black woman whose love, pain, and power transcended her time. Paul Winfield. Paul Winfield, born in 1939 in Los Angeles, left an indelible mark on film and television through his commanding performances and dignified presence. He gained critical acclaim for his role as Nathan Lee Morgan in the 1972 film Sounder, earning an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, a rare achievement for a Black performer during that era. His portrayal of powerful yet vulnerable characters helped break racial barriers in Hollywood, further solidified by his performance as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1978 miniseries King. While Winfield became a household name for his on-screen brilliance, his personal life remained deliberately out of public view. Hollywood in the 1970s and 80s was a place where being openly gay, particularly for black men, meant risking not only career opportunities but also basic safety. As such, Winfield kept his sexuality private, even dating women like co-star Cicely Tyson briefly to deflect suspicion. Yet within his trusted circle, he was known to be gay, and lived for over 3 decades with his partner architect Charles Gillen Jr. Their long-term relationship was kept so discreet that many were unaware of its depth until after both had passed Gillen in 2002 and Winfield in 2004 from a heart attack. The loss of his partner reportedly had a profound emotional effect on him, compounding his own health issues. Unlike many closeted celebrities of his time, Winfield did not engage in public denial. Instead, he simply chose discretion over disclosure. Though he never made headlines for his personal life, Paul Winfield's quiet authenticity and refusal to conform to Hollywood's expectations made him a quiet pioneer. His career, marked by grace and gravitas, lives on in classic performances, while his hidden truth reflects the struggles of countless others forced into silence by the era's prejudice. Today, Winfield is remembered not just for what he gave to the screen, but for what he bore in silence behind it. Nell Carter. Nell Carter's powerful voice and magnetic stage presence made her one of the most beloved entertainers of her era. Born in 1948 in Birmingham, Alabama, she rose from modest beginnings to win a Tony Award in 1978 for her standout role in Ain't Misbehavin', showcasing her immense talent and dynamic vocal range. She later became a household name for her role as Nell Harper in the popular 1980s sitcom Gimme a Break, where her charm, comedic timing, and emotional depth endeared her to millions. Despite her bubbly on-screen persona, Carter's personal life was layered with hardship and complexity. She suffered from diabetes, struggled with substance use, endured multiple miscarriages, and dealt with the pressures of single motherhood. She eventually adopted 3 children, building a non-traditional but loving family in private. Though Carter was twice married to men, her closest and most enduring relationship was with Ann Kasser, her longtime companion, with whom she shared a home in Beverly Hills. This deeply personal partnership remained hidden from the public eye throughout Carter's life. It wasn't until her untimely death from heart disease in 2003 at the age of 54 that the truth surfaced. Her will left her entire estate to Ann and named her the legal guardian of Carter's children, a revelation that confirmed the depth of their bond. The relationship, though never publicly acknowledged, was clearly central to Carter's personal world. In a time when being a black woman and part of the LGBTQ+ community invited both scrutiny and discrimination, Nell Carter chose to protect her privacy rather than fight for visibility. Still, her talent, resilience, and the love she nurtured in silence speak volumes about the challenges queer entertainers faced. Her legacy lives on in every note she sang, every line she delivered, and in the quieter truths that emerged after her final bow. Sherman Hemsley. Sherman Hemsley rose to fame by bringing one of television's most iconic characters to life, George Jefferson, the brash, opinionated businessman in The Jeffersons. With his sharp delivery and unforgettable comedic flair, Hemsley helped redefine the portrayal of black families on television during the 1970s and 80s. The groundbreaking sitcom was one of the first to depict an affluent black family, and Hemsley's fiery performance made him a cultural staple across generations. Off-screen, however, the man behind George Jefferson was remarkably different, soft-spoken, introverted, and fiercely private. Hemsley never married, never had children, and kept his personal life tightly guarded. Rumors about his sexuality followed him throughout his career, but he never addressed them publicly. Instead, he remained focused on his work, maintaining a solitary lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to his larger-than-life television persona. Following his death in 2012 from lung cancer at the age of 74, close friends, including fellow actor Garrett Morris, confirmed that Hemsley had been gay. He had quietly lived as a closeted man for decades, his sexual orientation known only to a small circle of confidants who respected his desire for discretion. His choice to remain silent wasn't rooted in shame, but in a need for self-preservation, in an industry that at the time often penalized actors, especially black men, for being openly queer. Hemsley's story is emblematic of a generation of entertainers who were forced to separate their personal truths from their public identities. While he never came out publicly, his life sheds light on the silent burdens many carried. Today, his work continues to bring joy and laughter, while the quiet truth of his identity reminds us of how much more complex and human our heroes really are. Billy Strayhorn. Billy Strayhorn was one of the most gifted composers, arrangers, and pianists in American jazz history, yet his name is still too often eclipsed by that of his legendary collaborator Duke Ellington. Born in 1915 in Dayton, Ohio, and raised in Pittsburgh, Strayhorn developed a love for music early on. At just 23, he joined Ellington's band, and their partnership produced some of jazz's most enduring classics, Take the A Train, Lush Life, and Chelsea Bridge among them. Though Ellington was the public face, Strayhorn was the creative architect behind much of the band's musical innovation. What set Strayhorn apart wasn't just his genius, it was his quiet refusal to hide. At a time when being black and gay in America was a dangerous intersection of identities, Strayhorn chose to live authentically, though not loudly. He did not publicly declare his sexuality in interviews or on stage, but those closest to him knew the truth. Within the relatively progressive jazz community, his relationships with men were understood and respected, even if never openly discussed. Strayhorn used his art as both shield and revelation. His compositions often carried emotional depth and nuance that reflected the internal complexities of a man living between worlds. In his private life, he was known to be warm, witty, and deeply principled, supporting civil rights causes and often donating earnings anonymously. Strayhorn died in 1967 at the age of 51 from esophageal cancer. Duke Ellington honored him with the suite, and his mother called him Bill, a moving tribute to a man he once called my right arm, my left arm, the eyes and the back of my head. Though Strayhorn never sought the limelight, his influence reshaped the sound of American music. Today, he is remembered not just as Ellington's secret weapon, but as a quiet pioneer who lived with grace and integrity in a world that rarely made space for men like him. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston was a generational talent, a 6-time Grammy Award winner whose voice transcended genre, race, and era. Born in Newark, New Jersey in 1963, she became one of the best-selling recording artists of all time with over 200 million albums sold globally. Her hits like I Will Always Love You and Greatest Love of All cemented her place in pop music royalty. But while her vocal range and radiant image dominated the public stage, a hidden aspect of her life remained sealed behind closed doors until after her death. Throughout her career, Houston was closely associated with Robin Crawford, her childhood friend and longtime confidant. Their bond sparked decades of speculation, with whispers in the tabloids often dismissed or silenced. Whitney's image, shaped by both the music industry and her devout religious upbringing, left little room for queerness. She married singer Bobby Brown in 1992, a turbulent relationship that only deepened public scrutiny. In 2019, Crawford confirmed in her memoir, A Song for You, that their relationship had once been romantic. According to Robin, Whitney ended the physical side of their bond in the early 1980s to protect her career and appease her religious family, including her mother, Cissy Houston, who reportedly disapproved of homosexuality. Still, Robin remained by Whitney's side for years as her creative director and emotional anchor. Behind the scenes, Houston struggled with addiction fame and the pressure of maintaining a public image that was never entirely her own. Her 2012 death by accidental drowning, linked to heart disease and cocaine use, shocked the world. In its aftermath, truths long buried began to surface. Today, Whitney Houston is remembered not only for her incomparable talent, but also for the silence she carried. Her story reflects the harsh expectations placed on queer Black women in the public eye. In acknowledging the love she couldn't name aloud, the world now sees Whitney in fuller color, not just as a star, but as a human being who longed to be free. Octavia Estelle Butler. Octavia Estelle Butler revolutionized the world of science fiction not through spectacle, but by embedding the genre with soul justice and quiet rebellion. Born in 1947 in Pasadena, California, Butler was a painfully shy child raised by her widowed mother, a domestic worker. Against the odds and in a genre dominated by white male voices, she carved out a legacy as the first Black woman to gain international acclaim in speculative fiction. Her groundbreaking novels, Kindred Parable of the Sower and Dawn, among others, blended dystopia, Afrocentric philosophy, and deeply human characters. Butler's work consistently explored themes of alienation, power, and transformation, resonating especially with readers on the margins. Though she never publicly identified as part of the LGBTQ+ community, those close to her noted that she may have lived as a lesbian. Unlike her more outspoken contemporaries, Butler remained intensely private. She never married, had no known romantic partnerships in the public sphere, and left behind no explicit declarations about her sexual orientation. Yet her characters often reflected queer subtexts, outsiders struggling with identity, gender fluidity, and emotional vulnerability. Critics and scholars have long interpreted her fiction as a coded articulation of Black queer existence, written during a time when such openness could jeopardize both safety and success. Butler also questioned societal norms around reproduction, family, and sexuality, pushing the boundaries of what speculative fiction could be. She passed away unexpectedly in 2006 from a stroke at age 58. Though quiet in life, her impact has only grown posthumously. Today, she is revered not only as a literary pioneer, but as a beacon for queer writers of color who saw themselves perhaps for the first time reflected in genre fiction. Octavia Butler challenged the world not by standing at the podium, but by writing stories that made readers rethink the world and their place in its stories, born from a mind both brilliant and beautifully complex. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman's voice was velvet wrapped in ache, rich, resonant, and filled with emotional precision. Born in 1949 in Philadelphia, she became a towering figure in R&B and jazz during the 1970s and 1980s, best known for songs like You Know How to Love Me, Old Friend, and Living All Alone. With her statuesque beauty, magnetic presence, and deeply expressive performances, Hyman captivated audiences who were drawn not just to her vocal power, but to the vulnerability behind it. Beneath her poised exterior, however, Hyman battled inner turmoil. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and openly struggled with depression throughout her career. These mental health issues, compounded by industry pressures and personal disappointments, led to periods of self-isolation and substance use. Hyman frequently spoke about the emotional toll of fame and the loneliness that shadowed her success. Her romantic life remained largely private during her lifetime. While she had public relationships with men, it was only after her death in 1995 by suicide, just a week before her 46th birthday, that stories began to surface about her long-term companionship with musician Tina Clark. Friends and colleagues later suggested that this relationship had deep romantic significance. Though Hyman never publicly identified as bisexual, those close to her believed her emotional world was far more fluid and complex than what the public saw. In her lyrics, Hyman often channeled the longing and pain she carried inside. Songs about loneliness, unfulfilled desire, and silent suffering now take on a different light when viewed through the lens of her concealed identity. She didn't just sing love songs, she embodied them, especially the ones about the kinds of love that could never be fully claimed. Phyllis Hyman's legacy is one of beauty, pain, and unrealized freedom. Her music remains timeless not only for its vocal brilliance, but for the secrets it carried, the echoes of a woman whose love in all its forms lived most fully in her songs. Ma Rainey. Gertrude Ma Rainey, born in 1886 in Columbus, Georgia, wasn't just a blues singer. She was a cultural force who helped shape the very foundation of American music. Known as the Mother of the Blues, Rainey was among the first black women to record blues songs commercially, beginning in 1923 with Paramount Records. Over the span of her career, she recorded more than 100 songs, blending raw emotion with themes of survival, desire, and working-class struggle. What made Ma Rainey truly groundbreaking, however, wasn't just her musical contributions. It was her unapologetic queerness in an era of rigid moral codes. While she was legally married to a man, her lyrics and stage presence boldly challenged heteronormative expectations. Her 1928 song, "Prove It On Me Blues," is one of the earliest known examples of a mainstream recording that references lesbian desire. "Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men." Rainey performed in flamboyant outfits, headlined vaudeville circuits, and ran her own traveling show, often mentoring younger artists, including Bessie Smith. She created space not only for women in a male-dominated industry, but also for those who lived outside traditional notions of sexuality. Her openness about same-sex relationships, both in song and in private life, marked her as a revolutionary. Despite her boldness, she still faced the harsh realities of being a queer black woman in early 20th century America. Much of her queerness was erased from historical narratives until scholars and music historians began re-examining her lyrics and lifestyle decades later. Rainey died in 1939, but her legacy continues to thrive in the music of generations who followed. Today, she stands not only as a matriarch of the blues, but as an early beacon for LGBTQ+ representation. Her courage to live authentically on her own terms through her art broke barriers and opened doors for countless artists to embrace their full selves. Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith, born in 1894 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, remains one of the most influential vocalists in American music history. Dubbed the Empress of the Blues, she rose to fame in the 1920s and 1930s with a voice that could move mountains, rich, mournful, and unrelenting in its honesty. Her classic recordings, including Downhearted Blues and Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out, captured the suffering and resilience of Black America during the Jim Crow era. Smith's talent and commanding stage presence propelled her to stardom. By the mid-1920s, she was the highest-paid Black performer in the country. Her live shows were legendary, and she toured extensively with her own tent show, backed by some of the finest musicians of the time. But beyond the spotlight, Bessie led a life of personal defiance, especially when it came to her sexuality. Although married to Jack G., her relationships with women were an open secret within her inner circle. Numerous accounts describe her romantic entanglements with female chorus girls and performers while on tour. She never identified publicly as bisexual, but her behavior both in her personal life and in some of her bold lyrical choices reflected an authenticity rarely acknowledged in her era. Living openly as a queer Black woman in the early 20th century was dangerous, so Smith kept her truths mostly confined to trusted companions. Still, her quiet defiance challenged the limitations placed upon women in her time. She fought fiercely for creative control, financial independence, and the right to live as she pleased, even when that life included desires society refused to acknowledge. Bessie Smith died tragically in 1937 from injuries sustained in a car accident. For decades, her queerness remained a footnote in her larger story, but today it is seen as a vital part of her legacy. She was not just a musical pioneer. She was a woman who dared to love on her own terms, leaving behind a legacy as bold as her voice and as complex as her truth. Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan was a legal mind and political powerhouse who forever changed the landscape of American politics. Born in Houston, Texas in 1936, she broke barriers early and often. In 1966, she became the first Black woman elected to the Texas State Senate since Reconstruction, and in 1972, she made history again as the first Southern Black woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Her eloquence and fierce intellect earned her national acclaim, especially after her iconic speech during the 1974 Watergate hearings, where she defended the U.S. Constitution with unmatched gravitas. Though Jordan never publicly discussed her private life, she lived for over 30 years with her close companion, Nancy Earle, an educational psychologist. While their relationship was described by the media as a friendship, friends and colleagues understood the depth of their connection. Jordan, who was intensely private and deeply focused on public service, kept her personal affairs far from the spotlight, particularly because being a queer black woman in public office during the 20th century could have destroyed everything she had built. Despite battling multiple sclerosis and later leukemia, Jordan remained committed to her principles and public service until her death in 1996. In her final years, Nancy Earle cared for her full-time. While never openly labeled as a lesbian, Jordan's life and long-term partnership reflect the silent compromises many queer women of her era made to protect their careers. Her legacy today is one of brilliance, integrity, and quiet resilience. Barbara Jordan is remembered not only for her constitutional wisdom and commanding oratory, but also as a figure who likely bore the weight of dual invisibility both as a black woman and as someone who could not safely live out loud. Her story deepens the meaning of representation and reminds us that even the most powerful voices sometimes had to whisper their truths in private. Jackie Moms Mabley. Long before comedy clubs welcomed women or the LGBTQ+ community had public champions, Jackie Moms Mabley was shattering every rule in the book. Born Loretta Mary Aiken in 1894 in Brevard, North Carolina, she reinvented herself as Moms Mabley, a comedic powerhouse whose stage presence mixed irreverence with razor-sharp social commentary. Known for her signature toothless grin, colorful house dresses, and unapologetic humor, she tackled subjects like racism, poverty, and politics at a time when few dared. But offstage, Moms Mabley lived an even more revolutionary life. She was one of the first openly lesbian entertainers in the United States. While she often played the role of a flirtatious older woman chasing younger men in her acts in real life, she had romantic relationships with women and made no secret of it within her community. She reportedly came out in the 1920s, a move virtually unheard of for a black performer, let alone a woman. Despite the rampant homophobia and racism of the era, Mabley carved out a space where she could exist authentically. She performed on the vaudeville circuit, the Chitlin circuit, and eventually became a regular guest on national television programs like The Ed Sullivan Show and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, bringing black female and queer representation into living rooms across America, even if the public didn't know it. Mabley's courage wasn't limited to her sexuality. She was also a survivor of deep personal trauma, including abuse and the loss of several of her children. Yet she turned her pain into punchlines and found empowerment in laughter. She continued performing into her late 70s and passed away in 1975. Today, Moms Mabley is recognized not just as a comedic trailblazer, but as one of the earliest out-queer black entertainers. Her legacy is a masterclass in survival, authenticity, and speaking truth to power even when the world wasn't ready to hear it. Little Richard. Little Richard born. Richard Wayne Penniman in 1932 in Macon, Georgia, wasn't just a musician. He was a seismic force who helped birth rock and roll. With electrifying hits like Tutti Frutti Long, Tall Sally, and Lucille, his wailing falsetto, frenetic piano playing, and flamboyant stage presence captivated audiences and influenced generations of icons, including Prince James Brown and the Beatles. He didn't just push musical boundaries, he obliterated them. Offstage, Little Richard was just as complex. From the beginning of his career, he challenged gender norms with his bold fashion eyeliner, rhinestones, and pompadours that made him instantly recognizable. He spoke openly, albeit inconsistently, about his sexuality. In the 1950s and 60s, he acknowledged his attraction to men, but later in life, especially after religious awakenings, he renounced homosexuality, calling it sinful. These public contradictions often confused fans and obscured the truth of his identity. In truth, Little Richard struggled his entire life to reconcile his sexuality with his deeply held religious beliefs. Raised in a strict Christian household, he would go through periods of renouncing music altogether, devoting himself to ministry before returning to the stage. Yet throughout his career, he never shied away from being flamboyant and androgynous, indirectly giving voice to queer expression in a deeply conservative era. Despite this tension, he never explicitly denied his romantic and sexual relationships with men. Friends, fellow performers, and biographers have confirmed that he lived as a gay man for most of his life, even as he wrestled with internalized homophobia. When he passed away in 2020 from bone cancer at age 87, tributes poured in not just for his music but for his cultural significance. Little Richard was a pioneer in every sense, a queer black man who laid the foundation for an entire genre while never being fully accepted by the mainstream he helped create. His legacy is not just in the sound he invented, but in the courage he embodied even when it came wrapped in contradiction. Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was the brilliant behind-the-scenes architect of the civil rights movement, a man whose intellect, discipline, and moral clarity helped change the course of American history. Born in 1912 in West Chester, Pennsylvania, Rustin was a staunch pacifist, a gifted organizer, and a visionary thinker. He's best remembered as the chief organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, an event that required extraordinary coordination strategy and diplomacy. Yet Rustin's name remained largely absent from public recognition for decades. Why? Because he was openly gay at a time when being both black and queer rendered someone politically radioactive. Arrested in 1953 on morals charges for consensual sex with another man, Rustin's sexuality was used repeatedly by both segregationists and even allies to discredit him. He was pushed into the background by civil rights leaders who feared his identity would damage the movement's public image. Still, Rustin refused to hide. He lived openly with his longtime partner Walter Nagel and never compromised his beliefs, whether fighting for labor rights, racial equality, or international peace. His radical honesty cost him visibility during his lifetime, but it never shook his commitment to justice. After decades of being sidelined, Rustin finally received posthumous honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, awarded by President Barack Obama. Bayard Rustin died in 1987, but his legacy has only grown more luminous with time. He was a master organizer, a prophetic voice, and a man who lived authentically in the face of rejection. In a movement defined by dreams, Rustin embodied one of the most difficult, the dream of being fully seen, not just for his work, but for who he was. Today, he is remembered not just as a tactician of civil rights, but as a pioneer of queer black visibility and integrity. At Legends of Black Excellence, our goal is to honor the full truth of these trailblazers, not just their fame, but their humanity. Acknowledging their sexuality is not about sensationalism. It's about restoring erased identities and giving voice to stories long silenced. These individuals shaped culture while carrying burdens they couldn't share publicly. Recognizing their queerness does not diminish their greatness, it completes it. If we truly celebrate their excellence, we must embrace all of who they were. Let's move beyond discomfort and into deeper understanding. History isn't rewritten by truth, it's completed by it. What part of their legacy speaks to you most,